It's Friday, December the 13th. From The Economist in London, this is The Week Ahead, a look at some of the stories that will be in the headlines next week. I'm Daniel Franklin, Executive Editor at The Economist.
And I'm Tom Standage, the Digital Editor. In The Week Ahead, Nelson Mandela's funeral is held, Germany gets a new government, Ireland exits its international bailout programme, and a Chinese probe lands on the moon. Daniel, let's start with Nelson Mandela, who's clearly going to dominate headlines next week, as he has this week. What exactly is going to happen then on the 15th?
Well, it's his final laying to rest at his ancestral home of Kunu, so the long farewell reaches its end in actually rather a small, remote part of the Eastern Cape. And the weather forecast is not good, so it could be a rather muddy occasion with a place that has no airport, having to have the world's dignitaries flown in, plus hordes of press who will give it blanket coverage. So the population of the area, which is normally about 40,000, will more or less double. There's an enormous white tent has been erected. So it's a final opportunity to say goodbye to the great man. But the question that remains after the booing that Jacob Zuma, South Africa's president, received at the memorial service is whether the country will emerge united or actually more deeply divided as it heads into an election year. Moving to Germany, Tom, the country finally gets a government. We thought that the election had produced a very clear win for Angela Merkel, but it's taken some time for her to pull together her coalition government.
It has indeed, yes. Although Angela Merkel's CDU-CSU grouping won decisively in September, they didn't have an overall majority. And previously they've had a coalition with the Free Democrats. The Free Democrats did very badly indeed, failed to reach the 5% threshold that Germany has to keep extremist parties out. And so Angela Merkel has had to look elsewhere for a coalition partner, and finally has done a deal which took several weeks to put together with the main opposition party, the SPD. But the SPD said that they were going to put any deal to their members for approval. So there's a referendum taking place, and the result will be announced on Saturday afternoon on December the 14th. That's probably going to be a yes. It'd be very surprising if it wasn't. But it was another hurdle that was put there. But the SPD demanded some concessions from Angela Merkel as the price of going into coalition. It wants a minimum wage introduced, and it also wants the pension age to be reduced, having been put up in a previous parliament. And so Angela Merkel's party is not terribly pleased about this. It's not the sort of fiscal rectitude that Germany is known for. And at the same time, members of the SPD are worried that actually going into coalition with a centre-right party is sort of betraying their left-wing principles. So there is grumbling on both sides, but it will probably get through, and that will mean that Angela Merkel can name her cabinet over the weekend and can be sworn in again as Germany's Chancellor next week. So it's all taken a rather long time. And of course, this doesn't help when you've got Germany as the strongest power within a Eurozone that still has an awful lot of problems, despite talk of the Euro crisis being over. The SPD is actually quite good as far as the Euro crisis is concerned, in the sense that it's keen on things like banking union. But these concessions that it's forced Angela Merkel to make actually take Germany in the opposite direction it needs to go, particularly because its economy isn't as strong as it sometimes looks to outsiders. So I think what we can expect to see next year is that Angela Merkel will be trying to water down these concessions as they're actually turned into policy. Staying within the Eurozone, let's turn to Ireland, which is exiting the bailout. This is quite an achievement, isn't it? Because it was widely expected that they wouldn't be able to stay the course when the bailout was initially dished out.
It is an achievement, and it's a landmark also for the Eurozone, because Ireland is the first country to exit a bailout. And you mentioned earlier that Germany is the strongest country in the Eurozone. It's very keen to see countries like Ireland as success stories to show that the rescue efforts can bear fruit, and then countries can stand on their own 2 feet. And Ireland will be exiting and being able to finance its borrowing needs in the market rather than relying on its Eurozone and other helpers. So to that extent, it's a thoroughly good thing, and it is a success story for the Eurozone. But it's not one that will be celebrated with huge joy, because it has come at an enormous cost. There's been a savage recession, massive budget cuts, great hardship in Ireland. And still the economy, although returning to growth, is only going to be expanding by perhaps between 1% and 2% next year, with more painful cuts ahead. So it's a difficult time for the Irish. Very high youth unemployment, a lot of emigration. The key thing, though, I think, is that Ireland will be set up as an example of a country which takes the tough decisions, is capable of introducing rather dramatic, bold change, and that will be held up to other countries that are still in their programmes, such as Greece and Portugal, that this is the way to go, and look what happens if you do follow this through vigorously and bravely, you can exit too. Well, finally, Tom, let's leave Earth altogether and travel to the moon with the Chinese rover, which is going to be landing on the moon. What's the significance of this?
Well, it has to be said it's mostly political rather than scientific. This probe, it's an unmanned probe, was launched on December the 2nd. It went into orbit around the moon this week, and the orbit has gradually been lowered so that it's getting closer and closer to the surface, and the plan is to have it land over the weekend. And it will then have this six-wheeled rover of the kind we're quite familiar with seeing the American similar rovers on Mars. It looks very much like those, not because the Chinese have copied the design, but because there's now very good science about how you do rovers, and the answer is you give them six wheels and solar panels, and so it's a good design. That said, it's got some instruments. It's got a ground penetrating radar. It's going to be able to look at the rock, the regolith of the moon's surface, the sort of equivalent of soil, and it's thought to be able to scan as much as 100 meters under the surface. But it's really about showing that the Chinese can do what the Americans and the Soviets have done before. The last time, in fact, that a probe was put on the moon was in 1976 by the Soviets. A couple of other probes have been deliberately crashed into the moon since then, but that's not really the same. So this is the first time that there's going to be a deliberate, careful landing, and then some science will be committed by some instruments on the ground. So it's not probably going to lead to any great striking breakthroughs, but there is this new space race going on between China and India. India has its probe on the way to Mars, and so the Chinese want to show that they can do all of the things that the Cold War powers did, and it actually wants to go beyond that. It wants to do a sample return mission from the moon next. It's in the process of building a space station, and so on. So this is chiefly a I can do that too signal from China.
Well, that's our orbit of the Earth for this time. Do join us again next week for another look at the week ahead. From London, this is The Economist.